Good morning. Welcome to Sunday School this morning. We're going to look this morning in the book of Acts, and we are looking at Acts chapter 21 as we start. We have been following Paul and Luke, and so this morning we are looking at the theme testifying to the gospel. Testifying to the gospel. It is a responsibility of the church and of every Christian to testify about Christ to the lost. So we have a responsibility to tell people about the Lord, to tell them about what the Lord has done, is doing in our lives. Well, there you go. There you go. So this past week I was talking to someone, and in talking to them, you know that on the national and in the local scene, there's a lot of stuff that's going on. There's a lot of bad stuff going on. There are people that should be standing up for righteousness, and they say one thing, they do another thing, and so as we were talking about it, I said, well, you know, I can't do anything about all those people out there. I can't even do anything about the people that are right close by, but I can do something about the circle that I walk in. And what that means is that I need to do and say the right things all the time around me for the people that I interact with. I need to do the right thing. Our key verse today is in Acts 22. It says, "For you will be his witness to all people of what you have seen and heard." It's close to what Jesus said in Acts 1:8, "You will be witnesses to me both in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the world." So this is Paul letting us know that we all have a responsibility. God had brought Paul from persecuting Christians to now testifying for Christ. This is 180 degrees from where he was. He has gone from against, now preaching. And so we testify no matter the dangers it can bring. Paul's going to find himself sometimes jumping out of the frying pan right into the fire. And we have a responsibility to stand up for righteousness. We need to be totally committed to Christ. If we're not committed, it's not going to cut it. That commitment means to be all in. There's an old joke about back in the days of when flying was a new thing. And at the local county fairs, sometimes there would be pilots that would give people rides in airplanes, trying to get public opinion toward them. And so this older feller, he was skeptical, and so the guy took him for a ride, came down, he asked him afterwards, says, "Well, what do you think about that?" He said, "Well, I still don't know." He said, I didn't put my whole weight on it." Well, if you're in the airplane and it gets, you've got your whole weight on the thing. In court, what does a witness have to do? They have to swear to tell the whole truth. They can't tell nothing but the truth. Now, it used to be in our country when you went into court, they would take a Bible and you would put your hand on the Bible and you would swear, as Heidi just said, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. I don't. There some courts, they don't have you do the "so help me God." Some of them still do, but does that mean that every person that puts their hand on a Bible and swears to tell the truth, does that mean they're telling the truth? You know that some people, they can lie like a cheap rug, right? They can look at you and not even bat an eye and lie. Okay, question number 2. Paul is falsely accused, and this is from verses 26 through 29. He's falsely accused. There were some people in Jerusalem. Paul met with the leaders of the church back in Jerusalem, and this is something Paul did several times. You remember back in Acts 15, there was a question about what do people need to do to become a Christian, and so the church, do we need him to become a Jew first and follow all of the 633 commandments of the law, small L law? And remember what they convened and said, no, the law couldn't save us in the first place, so we can't put that yoke upon them. And they had agreed that Gentile converts did not need to follow Jewish law. There's a little bit of a difference here between Jewish law and God's law. The Jewish law refers to all of those 633 commandments that had been added to the 10 commandments. They wanted to make sure that Paul was not teaching Jewish Christians to abandon the capital L law, and that is that they were not abandoning God. So in this process, to show that Paul was not abandoning the law, he supported several men who apparently had taken a Nazirite vow. And in the process of taking this vow, Paul likely paid for the sacrificial animals that were to be sacrificed for it, and he gave notice to the priests on the date when the offerings were to be made. The men at this time, in Paul's day, the men typically, to do that vow, they would shave their heads, and from during that time period, from then on until the vow was completed, they wouldn't shave their heads. So the shaving of the head at the beginning was removing all impurities, symbolism. You know what gets in your hair, right? Bugs, yes. All kinds of stuff gets in your hair. When I'm mowing and out working on, building a bench, I'll go like this, and I got sawdust and all kinds of grass and stuff. And so now, for a period of time, what's going on here are two things at the same time. There were Jews that had not accepted and did not accept Christ. They continued to worship the Lord. They continued to offer sacrifices at the temple. And then you had Jewish Christians that were following Jesus, following after the Lord, and for a period of time, they offered sacrifices also, not out of the necessity of the sacrifice covering their sin, but out of respect for the law and out of respect for trying to be a witness to them. And so there may be times that out of respect for someone, we may not do everything they do on a continuing basis, but while we're with them, so that we don't insult them, we may go along with their traditions. Okay? For example, some people may open their Christmas presents on Christmas Eve, right? And some people wait until Christmas Day. And some people wait all the way until Epiphany, 12 days after Christmas, because that's when the wise men brought their gifts. And so, but either way you do it, there's no right and there's no wrong. Now, we want to be respectful, and that's what was happening here. So Paul was showing that he was not preaching against God. So there were some false charges from Jews from the province of Asia who were in the temple to worship at this time. And you remember that Paul had been preaching in Asia Minor, and as he was preaching there, again, some of those people that were there had heard Paul, and they were now back in Jerusalem, and some of these guys brought false charges. They stirred up the crowd, and they grabbed a hold of Paul. And here are some of the things they said. He maligned his own people, the Jews. In other words, when he was up there in Asia Minor, this is what he was doing. He taught against the Mosaic law, and he taught against the temple. They claimed that Paul brought Greeks into the holy place in the temple. Now, you know there are some people that they just want to keep things all stirred up, right? There are some, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's at home, at work, at play, at church. Some people, they would rather stir up stuff than eat a steak dinner. Some people are just wired that way. And these people, they're looking for trouble, and they're looking to get Paul in trouble. Now, Gentiles could worship in the outer court, but were forbidden from coming any further. If you think about the temple, you think about it was walled all the way around, and there were gates, and these gates were open during the day, and in the outer court, remember where it says that Jesus taught at the temple? Well, that's where Jesus taught. You go through from the street, you go through the outer gates into the courtyard, and over in little places or just anywhere, different men would teach all day long to whoever wanted to listen. So there were always people, this was always going on. Have you ever seen pictures or videos of people praying at the Wailing Wall? Have you ever seen that? Yeah. And if you look closely at the Wailing Wall, you will see little tiny pieces of paper that people have written prayer requests on, and they roll them up, and in the little cracks between the stones, they slide them in there. When Amanda was sick, when she first had her heart attack, Frank was the company that he was working for. All of a sudden, they said, "We need you to go to Israel." and he had to go to Israel, and he was there for about a week or so because they had him work. He does computer IP stuff, internet stuff, and they said, no, we need you there on the ground to do this. So while Frank was over there, he got to visit the Wailing Wall, and he wrote on a little tiny piece of paper and rolled it up, and he tucked it in there, "Pray for Amanda's healing," and he put it in the Wailing Wall. And I thought that was pretty cool. So as if you've ever seen a video of it, it sounds like chaos, doesn't it? Have you seen video in how people stand there and they pray, they chant, and everybody's saying their own prayers. And sometimes when we have you as a congregation, we'll say the Lord's Prayer or the Apostles' Creed, and we have some people saying it faster than other people and slower, and that, and sometimes it sounds like chaos, and so it sounds like chaos there, and that's what it was like in Jesus' day, or for hundreds of years. Different rabbis would be teaching, and they'd have disciples gathered around them, and Jesus was no different. And so the Gentiles and non-believer Gentiles, they could come into the outer court, but they couldn't go any further. Now, the parts of the temple, the outer court, and then you have the inner court, which is the holy place, and then beyond that, there's the veil, and then there's the Holy of Holies. All right? And now only Jewish men were allowed to go into inside the wall of the temple proper, into the holy place. Only Jewish men were allowed to go there. Jewish women were not allowed, and Gentiles were not allowed. Even Gentile converts who had been converted, had been circumcised, and they observed all the rituals. And on the outside, they may even look like the Jewish people, but they were not allowed to go into that inner court. And so the Jews of Asia recognized Trophimus. Now, he was an Ephesian Gentile whom they had seen earlier that day with Paul. And he was in the outer court, and they falsely accused of Paul bringing him further than the Gentile court. They accused him of that. Just because he had been with Paul earlier in the day in the outer court did not mean that Paul had taken him further. Again, remember what the title of this section here is: falsely accused. All it takes is somebody saying, well, I think I saw, and then it becomes, I saw it. And then I swear that I saw it. Okay. So, Paul was arrested. Earlier, he's been grabbed. He's arrested, and he's questioned in verses 30 to 36. And as this is happening, a riot broke out in verse number 30. And Paul was dragged from the temple so that the rioters could not pollute the temple by shedding his blood there. So the priests that were responsible for watching the area, to say that Paul brought a Gentile, Trophimus, into the inner court, in the first place, Paul would never have done that. On the second part, the gates were guarded by the Levites, and even after what happened to Korah in his immediate family, his sons, the sons of Korah, redeemed themselves, and later they became the guards of the temple gates. And so they never would have allowed a Gentile to go into the inner court. But when this riot happens, there were not only were there the temple gatekeepers, but there were also temple guards, and there were also priests that were in the area to make sure that no one did profane the temple. And so they pushed them out of the area, out of the temple inner court, and towards the Gentile court, just in case someone were to kill Paul. That's how angry this mob was. Now, Gentiles could worship in the outer court, and the Levite gatekeepers shut the gates after he was removed. So he couldn't get back in, but neither could the rioters. If the rioters, if they could now pollute themselves. Remember some of the laws in the Old Testament of cleanliness and uncleanliness? And so if you hit somebody and you drew blood, now your hand is now unclean. You would have to wash it like 7 different times, and you'd have to wait 24 hours before you could do anything religious. So if they started fighting, and perchance one of them walked back into the temple area, well, the priest would just have a conniption fit about that. So they closed the gates. None of you are coming back in. So without any trial, the rioters beat Paul, fully intending to kill him. You do know that that's what happens with mob mentality, right? I had someone years ago, they said, every time I hang around with this person, they always get me in trouble. So I said, don't hang around with them. And they were adults. That every time we get together, they get me in trouble. They get talked into stuff, okay? So these rioters, that's what happens with the mob. They go too far. Okay, question number 5. The Roman commander of the regiment at Jerusalem rescued Paul. You do remember that Israel is still under Roman rule. There is a garrison, there's a legion of soldiers in the area. Jerusalem is the capital. It's where the temple is, so pilgrims were constantly coming and going and coming and going. And it was real easy to get a riot going, and that riot, the Romans didn't, when the Roman centurion, when he sees this riot, he doesn't know what the riot is about. It could have been a religious thing. It could have been something like, remember when they brought the woman caught in adultery? Remember that? They brought that person to Jesus to see what he would say. Remember when Stephen was stoned? Remember that? It could have been a religious thing. Or it could have been a revolt against the Roman soldiers. And so since they didn't know what was going on, the soldiers swooped in, they grabbed Paul, and they rescued him to get him out. This goes back to a criminal knows what they're going to do, right? The bank robber, they know they're going to rob the bank. And now the police officer doesn't know what the criminal is going to do. You hear every once in a while that someone had a gun and they were shooting at the police officer, and the police returned fire and the guy is killed, the guy dies. And you'll hear some person, they say, well, they should have shot the gun out of his hand. That only happens on TV, on Westerns. Only Roy Rogers and the Lone Ranger, only those guys can shoot. And what is funny, is hilarious about that is the guy has the gun in front of himself. And they shoot the gun out of his hand. He goes, oh, like that right there. The gun was in front of him and he shot it. Where did the bullet go? If he shot the gun out of his hand right there, where's the bullet going to go? Right in the guy's chest. Okay? And so they said, that's ludicrous to think that the police officer would go, okay, I'm going to try to shoot, the gun. And they said that in the police officers that fire their weapons across the country, when they are shooting at bad guys with the intent policemen are taught to fire at the center of the target, right? Okay? And so they're firing at the center. Out of all of the shootings that they shoot, they only hit the target 17%. That's shooting at center. Imagine the lower percentage if you were now shooting at the guy's gun. Okay? That would be silly. So the crook knows what's going to happen. How many of you have been watching on the news the riots and the burning that's been happening over in Paris? Has anybody seen that? Have you seen any of the news on that? And Paris is almost under curfews. It's almost under martial law. This kid, I don't know how, I think he was 17. They stopped him, a traffic stop. He violated the law. They stopped him, and when they stopped him, he pulled a gun on the police officer, and then he jumped in his car to drive. He was in the middle of town, and so they shot him, and the kid died. The kid had about a dozen traffic, I don't want to say tickets, traffic arrests, because he had been stopped a dozen times, and every single time that he was stopped, they got involved in a high-speed chase through the city, and people were hurt and everything. And so as soon as the police officers saw, came up who he was, they knew what this guy was going to do, and people were going to get hurt. But do the people that are rioting care? No, they're burning the city. All right. So the Roman commander, he rescues Paul. Such unrest had to be stopped to prevent sedition charges. If this riot is not quelched, Paul and the temple leaders and even people in the crowd would have been arrested and charged with trying to throw off the Roman government, and they would have been executed. So the commander arrested Paul and ordered him to be bound, to show the crowd that Paul would not escape justice, hoping that would calm the crowd down. He asked the crowd about Paul's identity. Who is this guy, and what did he do? But he learned nothing in the loud and confusing exchange. The people just started, they were screaming and hollering. They just wanted Paul destroyed. So Paul was taken to the citadel of Antonia, just nearby. That was the barracks and the courthouse of the Roman imperial occupation. They carried Paul on their shoulders up the stairs to protect him. The crowd wanted to continue beat and kill Paul. Now, everyone has a life before coming to Christ. Even Paul. So the commander was surprised to find that Paul knew Greek. That he could understand and talk Greek. He did not expect a common Jew to know Greek. He asked Paul if he was an Egyptian who was leader of a rebellion among the 4,000 murderers. That's in verse number 38. At this time, there was an Egyptian that was fighting against the Roman occupation, and he was leading a group of some 4,000 rebels against the Romans. And he won this. When he was questioned, he was asked if he was that Egyptian. So Paul identifies himself as a Jew and a citizen of Tarsus in Cilicia. Tarsus was known as a city of learning and a city of commerce, verse number 39. And so when Paul said that he was of that area, it's letting this commander know that Paul is a well-educated individual. Now, question number 7, Paul asked for permission to address the crowd. The commander, he is persuaded by Paul, and he's persuaded to talk to the crowd. The commander obviously thinks that, if Paul can explain himself, then maybe these Jews will calm down. Now, most of us are reasonable people. Looking around in this room, most of us are reasonable people. And most of us believe that when you talk and explain things, we kind of believe that most people will accept a reasonable explanation and calm down, all right, and stop this riot. And so the commander says, okay, he's going to let him speak. So Paul directed, and he speaks in Hebrew. He directs his words to his fellow Jews, calling them men, brethren, and fathers. This is the same way that Stephen had addressed his persecutors. Paul was eager to declare he was innocent of these charges, all those things that he was accused of in earlier questions. Paul told them of his education by Gamaliel. At this time, Gamaliel was the top educator in Israel. He was the top Pharisee, the leading scholar. The name Gamaliel would have, when he said Gamaliel, everybody in that crowd immediately would have recognized him. Paul was in line to replace Gamaliel as the leading scholar before his conversion. Paul coming into the temple for this, to make these arrangements for the sacrifice, Paul would have come in with all of his religious regalia. When we say someone was dressed like the Pope, what do we mean? Robes, okay? If the Pope, if you know what the Pope dresses like, he's got that white robe and it's got designs on it, and he's got the big hat and it's got the cross on it, okay? People recognize it. It would be like saying, now I'm not in the military, so I wouldn't recognize it, but if a person had, I don't know what the symbol is for a general, I don't know what the bars are or the insignia. I don't know what that is, but I've never been in the military. But someone that was in the military, if they saw those bars or whatever they are as a general, what are they supposed to do? Salute, right? Come to attention and stay there until they say at ease. And so Paul, his garments would have been embroidered with designs to show his education. The hem of his garment would have had pomegranates on it. They would have been in a certain order. Have you ever seen, like at a graduation at a university, and when the either the professors come in or the students come in, they have these sashes, different colors. They have cords, different colors. You look at people's names, and it will say Ken Wilcox, PhD, DMV, MVD, RST. All those letters, those mean degrees and education, right? So they seen all of those things about Paul, and he says that he was in line for Gamaliel. Okay, all of a sudden they have the crowd's attention. He was a Pharisee of the Pharisees, the strictest form of Judaism. Those of you that have been around Pentecost for a while, you know that there are some, I'll say either churches or some denominations, even in Pentecost, that were really strict, right? They had dress codes and conduct codes, and just very, very strict. And Paul was one of those. And Paul had persecuted Christians. When Paul tells who he is, at first, all they're doing is pointing at Paul. All right? He. Now, when they identify him, it would be like there's a group of people, and they're pushing and shoving somebody, and when they come to, if you're looking at it, watching on the news, and there's a lot of commotion, and then if they focus the camera in on the person that is being hit or abused or whatever, and you look and you see it's Donald Trump, everybody recognizes him, right? Right? And if they don't recognize what he looks like, they're going to recognize the name. Okay? So they recognize Paul. He would have been known as Saul of Tarsus at the time. And so he identifies himself. He tells them about his conversion. He tells them what happened. A great light shone from heaven. He told of his vision of Jesus. Now, this mob would have probably been made up of Pharisees, and it would have been made up of Sadducees, maybe some Essenes, maybe some Zealots, and those different, quote, denominations of Judaism. The Essenes and the Pharisees, when he said he had a vision and he had a religious experience, immediately they were, really, it would be like today if someone here said, I was praying and the Lord gave me a vision. We would listen to you. Now, we would evaluate your vision, okay? And, did you really have a vision from the Lord? Does it sound like something the Lord would do? Or was it too much pizza last night before you went to bed? Okay? So most of them, he said he had a vision. And he heard the Lord speaking, why are you persecuting me? Now, earlier in, this was a decade or two earlier, Gamaliel, when the disciples had brought in to be beaten and told, don't preach the gospel. It was Gamaliel who told the high council, he said, look guys, if this Christian movement is from God, its opponents would find themselves fighting against him. And if you're fighting against God, guess what? You're going to lose. Okay. So in Damascus, Ananias prayed for Paul. And this is all things that Paul is telling them. Ananias was a well-known teacher to those in Jerusalem. So when he said Ananias of Damascus, they would, oh, we know who he is. The crowd listened intently to Paul until he claimed a divine calling to preach his message to the Gentiles. They did not want God's grace to be extended to Gentiles. Can we say prejudice? In the story of Jonah, at the end of the book of Jonah, is when Nineveh repents. What is Jonah's reaction? When Nineveh repents and God spares Nineveh, what is Jonah's reaction? Anybody? He's angry about it. Right? He wants Nineveh to be wiped out. You know, now for just reason. There are things that they did that were horrible. But God gave them an opportunity. And here, these people didn't want the Gentiles to receive God's grace. Now, Jesus faced that same issue in his ministry, okay? And I give you a couple places. The commander believed Paul was guilty because of the mob. Okay? If this mob is angry at Paul, they believe he believes that Paul has done something worthy of that. So he orders Paul to be flogged. Now, that was common practice. Someone was accused of some heinous crime, they would bring them in before they had a trial, and they would flog them, bring them back in, and ask them, now what do you have to say for yourself? And many times the criminal would confess, and then they would kill them. So he orders Paul to be beaten. The centurion told the commander that Paul was a Roman citizen. So before Paul was flogged, he asked them, is it legal to scourge? Is it legal to flog a Roman citizen? Now, a Roman citizen could be flogged if they had proper notification, if there was a trial, if they were found guilty, then they could be beaten, but not before the trial. And so the centurion tells the commander, wait a minute, Paul is a Roman citizen. Okay? It was unlawful to bind Paul and to scourge him without a trial. Now, the commander knew the seriousness of scourging a Roman citizen. He could be removed from his command position, and he could even suffer physical punishment. He could actually be executed himself. Now, confirming Paul was a citizen, the commander told Paul about his citizenship. He said, I paid a sizable amount of money to get my freedom. How about you? Paul responds that he was born a citizen. You've heard the term second-class citizen, right? Second class. Well, born free, first class. Buy your freedom, second class. This guy realizes he came this close to signing his own fate. Paul's citizenship kept him from being flogged. And it also protected the guy, the commander and the centurion. Paul's accusers thought they were protecting their faith. The people that were rioting, they thought that they were protecting the faith. But false accusations can be life-altering penalties. They can smear one's reputation in the public eye, even if found not guilty. You can be accused of something and didn't even do it, and at trial be found not guilty. But when you're accused, where's your picture? Where's the headline? Front page, right? On the top of it. They find you're innocent. Where do they report that? Yeah, in the help wanted ads. And that's if they print it. They may not even print it. And that's this little tiny print, you know, Ken murdered, great big letters. Ken found innocent, little tiny print. Okay. All right, we'll continue next week. Okay. And I have next week's lesson here. Robert's going to pass that out in just a moment. God bless you.